is that cybersecurity, it can be intimidating because it's a different domain to their own. So that's absolutely understandable as well. So to small businesses, I would also say, if you're not sure, seek an expert advice. Much the same way that I have degrees in mathematics and psychology, I can't change a light bulb. If I were to change a light bulb, I might electrify. If I were to do electrical work, I might hurt myself. So I'm going to seek expert advice on that. So it's also being accepting that this risk is here to stay. It's perpetual, it's evolving, and if you're not sure, ask an expert.
What are the kind of people that should have a say in developing this cybersecurity manifesto?
I think because, and it's not deferring to the academic answer to a complex question, academic institutions, a good example of organization is at risk, both in terms of the number of people on staff. You also have people on staff who fit those different user categories perfectly. You've got good users, not the bad users. You've got good users, but you've got also users who are maybe not as technologically literate. So for example, students in engineering are going to be much more technologically literate than students who study fine arts. And that's fine, but it means that we as an organization can work out, okay, how do we communicate this to people? I think that's how we communicate it internally within a university setting. That can apply quite well into the real world, but also the users have to come back and explain stuff to us as well.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Safe Tech Talk series, which is done by Cybersecurity. Very excited today to have Oliver as our guest speaker today. He has a very interesting background. He's exploring the intersection of psychology and cybersecurity. He's a very much sought after speaker and a thought leader in the industry. So Oliver, it's a privilege to be speaking with you today. We'd love to hear your journey so far. Over to you, Oliver.
Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. Any chance I get to talk about my science is I enjoy it quite a lot. So a bit about myself. So I call myself a cyber psychologist. I'm a Ph.D. researcher here at Edith Cowan University in Perth, in Western Australia. So the focus of my research is the set of all human factors that influence cybersecurity. But I don't just look at the human users. I particularly focus on network defense analysts. So people who are charged with the defense of sort of industrial sort of scale facilities, critical infrastructures and things of this nature. So my work spans the entire spectrum of user from the novice right up to the expert. I began sort of studying I began my journey through cyber in around about 2017, 2018. Was when I just finished my honours degree, and I was invited to be a research assistant on a study that was examining the stress response of network defense analysts in red-blue exercises, which essentially training mechanisms are used to prepare students for what incident response is like in the real world. And in that study, we were using essentially sweat sensors. So you can measure a lot about the human stress response by how much we sweat. So the actual thing that we were measuring is called the galvanic skin response. So the more you sweat, the more that we can detect changes in that sweat based on the conductivity of your skin. And what we were able to find was that I developed an algorithm that removed a sufficient amount of noise from that biometric information that we could map it to events that had actually happened during those red-blue exercises. So it was really quite a good experience to cut my teeth on in cyber, because it was, how can I phrase it? By utilizing a psychophysiological measurement to look at cyber, that has a robustness to it. It's not asking people's subjective opinion on a scale. It's a physical measurement of someone's bodily response to network defense. And so that project went extremely well, so well that I was then offered a full PhD scholarship full scholarship to do a PhD in much the same area, which was extremely lucky. It allowed me to pay my rent, pay my bills, as well as focus very closely on my research. And it was quite a luxury to have that sort of a capacity. So during my PhD, what I then decided to do was I wanted to look at SIEMs, so Security Event Information Management Systems. So these are the sorts of command and control consoles that network defenders will use when they're working in a cybersecurity operations center. And one of the problems that I encountered very on in my PhD was the fact that there's very limited tooling for a psychologist to come into the space and to operate. Because like different psychologists researchers utilize different methods, different paradigms of looking at things. My own personal one is I like to look at the biophysical. What can I physically measure? But in order to do that, you also need you need a task or a simulation to act as a test bed. And at the time I was looking around in the literature, and the only organizations that had anything approximating that was the United States Air Force. They had a few what I would call SEAM simulators. It's almost like if you think of what Microsoft Flight Sim is to flying a plane, that's the sort of software that the sort of simulator that I was trying to find for a SEAM. So I looked out and I found the ones that existed there was no way I was going to get access to that. And on top of that as well, what accounts were in the literature of these softwares was that they were quite antiquated. And for a reason is that just as cyber has an incredible pace of evolution and development, well, that means that the previous softwares that were developed, they were probably quite valid back in 2010, 2015. Cyber doesn't look that way anymore. So I looked out there and I had to make my own. So the simulator that I built, it's called the West Australian Cyber Defence Task, or the WACDT. Now, if you go Googling for that, you won't find anything just yet because the paper on it is in review. There is, however, so the literature review of that process has been published, but it will be published hopefully very, very shortly. But that was just the first part of the PhD. I was essentially just building the test bed, the experiment platform. Then what I decided to do was, I studied the human attention system and how the human attention system functions in network defenders. Because essentially there's a phenomenon, and it's called vigilance decrement. And we've known about it since World War II. And that is that when operators of any sort of command and control console, they're performing, when a task is monotonous and repetitive and must be performed for a long amount of time, people's attention just dips and it can't be sustained at peak optimal capacity for longer than around about 20 minutes. And that's a real problem in cyber when you think that the hacker only has to land an attack once, whereas your analysts have to be on the ball for peak performance, 8 hours a day. A lot of the times, these security operations centers, they're 24-hour operations as well. So what I then decided to do with my simulator was I wanted to examine how well does the human attention system, how well does it perform on a cybersecurity operations task on that WACDT. And what I found was that there were, if you compose the software in the WACDT just a bit differently, and these are things like that change the way that the user interacts with the system. It doesn't actually change any UI elements. It just changes features of UI elements. So these things include cognitive load. So how much information does the analyst have to process before recognizing a threat? The second one is signal salience. So how obvious is it that something's wrong? Event rate is a very big one as well, because if you're during an incident response, you're working quite a bit quicker. So you're also going to be utilizing a lot more energy in sustaining attention by virtue of the fact that you're processing more information at once. So there's a cognitive load, event rate, signal salience, and the fourth one is transitions in attention. So, for example, an email pops up providing new information. It can deviate how your attention's functioning. So I compared two forms of the WACDT. In the first form, it emulated what it's like in a security operations center when things are quiet. Now, that can be quite dangerous because things can slip through, because people are just processing monotonous information and that attention dips. And then I compared that to a second composition of that software, which was a lot more like incident response, where everything is set to the maximum difficulty. Now, what I found was that what I also did was, as people perform both of those different types of tasks, so we were tracking their hits, their misses, their false alarms, and we were working out a detection percentage. So how well is the person performing? So there's a behavioral metric there. But on top of that as well, I had the participants perform both tasks while they were wearing a brain scanner. And the brain scanner I used, there's a library of different types of brain scanners, but I used something called a functional near-infrared spectroscope. And what that specifically measures is blood, or rather oxygen utilization of the brain. And I did it right here. So that's your anterior frontal lobe, or the right one. So attention is sustained by both the left and the right. This side has the emotional reaction. This side solves the problem. So I was looking at this side specifically. Now, between those two different compositions of that scene simulator, what we found was that in the first type of task, so I refer to it as the static and the dynamic. The dynamic's the harder one. The static is the quiet one. So during the static task, people's performance, it improved over time. And when we looked at their brain information, what ended up happening was that resources go up, down, and up again. But what's important is that first point that it lands at is above where it rebounds to. When we look at that, at the brain information from the dynamic task, where things are much more difficult, it's a different story. Their performance declines over time, and the neural response, it goes up, down, and up again, but this time it ends up at a point that is above that initial spike. So what does that mean? Well, in one composition of software, you have performance improvement over time and a neural signature, a very precise neural signature of performance improvement, versus performance decline that we saw during that much more difficult type of task where it overcompensates. The explanation that I derive for this in my thesis is that when things are going very badly and during an incident response where things are very quick as well to move, the brain is flooded by blood, by oxygen. And the reason for that is that blood also carries sugars. Sugars are what we use to metabolize that energy, that information. So, but the thing is, you would think then if it's over flooding that brain, why is the performance declining? Because sugar in blood is not infinite. Over time, it drops and you can become hypoglycemic. So one of the takeaways that I took from my PhD is that every sock should have a lot of gummy bears lying around, because then they'll actually be able to, during those times, refuel some of that. You'll be able to mitigate some of that. So that was my PhD, and at the moment I'm working with the Security Research Institute on a project that I'm not privy to explain much about, but it essentially looks at the enhancement of cyber defensive capabilities for network defense analysts, and I look at the human factor role within that project. That's me, I suppose.
Oliver, that is a fantastic introduction. There is so much to unpack from there, right? It's so interesting. Once again, I find it super interesting that you're looking at human performance and limitations, human psychology in the field of cybersecurity. What motivated you to go down this path? Let's start with that.
I suppose I have two answers. The first answer is that I needed money, and the second answer is that I joke, of course. I just had a son, and I needed a career, but I didn't just want to get a job. I wanted a job doing this thing that I love. I'm very much a nerd, and I love science, and I love especially biopsychology. So seeing cyber has the human is the weakest link, and that's for a reason. And I was motivated to go into cyber because I suppose I haven't really seen any other people really do that in the way that I do it. I bring it's a psychological, but it's a neurological really voice to it. It's not that people are unmotivated or lazy. It's that the brain is a lump of meat with wires running through it. It's amazing that we can do any of this, but I suppose that's what motivated me to do it, is really to bring the psychological voice and insight into the problem.
Beautiful. And as you were doing this, you mentioned some of the insights, right? One of them tangibly having some sweet stuff lying around, gummy bears, when you're going through some kind of incident response or basically in a crisis mode. Because when one thing I've noticed in my past decade of work or so is that as software engineers, everybody has that one thing that they do. Some people like to drink Coca-Cola. Some people like to have Mountain Dew. My professor was a fan of Mountain Dew. I personally like to have some sweet like chocolates lying around. It does provide you that temporary spike where you can focus better, right? And it just gave a clearer explanation than usual of why that is the case, right? Blood is rushing to the brain with sugar, and you're able to focus better. You're able to be more engaged in the task that you're doing for a period of time. What other insights have you uncovered so far?
I love that your professor used Mountain Dew. That's one of the ones I've seen a lot. I've seen Mountain Dew used a lot, and Red Bull as well is used a lot.
Yes.
At the moment, so you can mitigate these things with diet, certainly, but you're essentially just riding a sugar rush to sort of get through it. Insofar as what else could be done, there's quite a lot that could be done. But the extent that I've seen it sort of managed is that, and it's, how can I phrase it? The way that it's managed at the moment is inefficient at best. The way that it's done is by shortening the length of time that analysts are on shift. So what we worked out, and this is quite robust in the literature as well, is that drop in attention when you're doing something monotonous, around about 20 minutes, much shorter, the harder the task. So like the shortest sort of shift pattern that I've seen for analysts is 2-3 hours. But even that, you can't hope to sustain peak optimal functioning within a 2-hour window. So what that means for the organization is that you have to hire a lot more people because they just burn and crash so far. But there is a lot more that could be tangibly implemented in SOCs to sort of mitigate around this, especially for SOCs that operate across 24-hour schedules, because then you've got all of the biophysical difficulties that come with having to work from 2 o'clock in the morning to 9 o'clock in the morning. It makes it harder. Sorry, no, let me rephrase that. You get worse attention during those times of the day. So if an incident response happens at night, you do not want your analyst to be in anything other than peak performance. Part of my career goals are to use science to demonstrate that it's more, you can do much more than just hire more people, much more, I suppose, if that answers your question.
Yes, it does. I'm also looking to see what further insights from cyber research that you have done, psychology research within the sphere of cybersecurity, maybe potentially even influences how we design software, right? Right. So you have done a bunch of work, and you probably have a point of view on how we can design software, or rather how current software design should evolve to incorporate cybersecurity design choices. Can you do you have thoughts around this? Can you share more?
Sure, I'd love to. So, especially for your audience that I'm coming at this, maybe not necessarily even from a cybersecurity specific perspective, but just even from a software development perspective. When you're designing systems for users, think about, so there's several different types of user: good users, bad users, smart users, and not smart users. Now, sometimes people fall nice and neatly into categories, but oftentimes they combine. For example, good users and smart users. Don't just design your system for those users. You have to assume that the other set of users also exist. That includes good users who are not so smart. So for example, my father was born in the 1960s, and he uses phrases like, "Can you Google your mother?" when he means phone call. So this is not a person who even really understands well what a password is. But more to the point, it's not that he's not smart. It's just that it's from a different generation. So when you're designing systems, you have to also understand that people are not going to use them, even if it's designed with all of their multi-factor authentication in the world. You have to understand that there are going to be problem users. And what that means is that you have to accept that at a certain point, you can put a boundary around what happens if a system is broken. But it also means that you have to assume that if the system is broken, that it doesn't mean a cataclysm. So for example, what that looks like is not retaining data that you don't need. So for example, if a service that you're signing up for sends a confirmation email to make sure that it's not spam, then on the back end, that email should be deleted. It should not be retained. And that's purely as a precaution. If an organization is ransomware and you've got a massive list of emails of customers, now become targets. But just to get back to those other users, bad users who are not so smart, they're increasingly becoming a problem in the world. And I'll touch on why in a moment. But bad users who are smart, these are the sorts of people who they design hacks. These are like red hat attackers. That's one thing as well. So when you're designing systems from a software engineering end, there is only so much you can do, but you also need to think about that fourth type of user who has got bad intentions, but who is also not very smart. Because as time is rolling on, and I see this a lot, is that it's the invention of new crimes, in the sense that the threshold of information, how smart does an attacker need to be to launch an attack, it keeps getting lower and lower and lower. And sometimes that's not just because the Red Hat community are making their tools more accessible. I'll give you an example. So one of the ones that I find particularly egregious is the invention of deepfake pornography. So that, for example, is not, though the technology behind it is absolutely sophisticated, but it's a dual use. You can use it to make memes and funny videos, and also have softwares that allow you, as a video editor with little to no training, you can go back and edit things. But it's the bad user. How is someone who is ill-intentioned going to use my system? So what does all of this mean for your audience is that when you're designing systems, think about those different types of users as well. So think about how the bad users, smart and not smart, can use your system, but also think about how can you protect the good users who maybe have no idea about what cybersecurity is.
Thanks for sharing. Let me just digest that for a bit, because what is happening in the world is, yes, AI is on the rise. Yes, you have deepfake technology, which is getting better and better and more easily accessible. As with most technologies, like for example, the internet or crypto, it is bad users who tend to use it first, right? And then the rest of the world tends to start to catch up. What can we do now at this point of time? What can be a practical takeaway for our audience, for the folks who have bad intention for some kind of harm with, let's say, deepfakes, phishing emails, and so on, right? What can be done?
What can be done is minimize your exposure, is what I would say. So, for example, one of the systems that I use is, and you see it across different sorts of websites, is log in with Apple or log in with Google. Now, websites that use that, I trust Google and Apple to have a cybersecurity team much better than a smaller individual company. So if my Google password is cracked, well, I can assume someone in Google who's probably, a highly esteemed, very well educated, et cetera, is going to have a better chance at fixing that. So minimizing your exposure. So if you sign up to a platform and it has and you have the option of signing in with those other organizations, bear in mind that it minimizes your exposure. You don't now have another service, another password that can be opened and accessed. So that'd be the first one. The second one I would suggest is be very careful about what information you put on social media. Open source intelligence is one of the main methods that hackers can use, red hats can use to find out who you are and attack you. So I heard one engineer a couple of years ago explain something to me, and he said that the greatest security liability of an organization is the CEO's Instagram page. What's the name of the dog? What school did you go to? What school do your kids go to? All of that information is there. These are answers to security questions. So minimize your exposure as much as possible. And also I would say for your audience is, just like my father, I would say be mindful of those who they're either not going to listen or they need to be protected. So this includes the elderly and the young, particularly for teenagers as well. I find myself increasingly wondering if we're approaching a world that needs to have no camera access for children whatsoever. And that is because red hats have ruined it, but not having that technology in a child's hand keeps them a lot safer. I don't know if that's the right solution, but to me, especially as a parent, it might actually be pragmatic.
What do you mean? Do you mean that a child should not have access to a smartphone or should not have access to cameras? What do you mean?
Well, ideally to smartphones. Well, no, actually, no. I don't think it's right to say children shouldn't have access to smartphones and technologies because that's also important because children are growing up in a world that is increasingly digital. They need to grow up in a way that they're prepared for adulthood. But I don't really see it as a necessity that a child have access to a camera. A great piece of advice I was told recently at a conference was whenever your children are using technology and feel it's okay to swear, that's when they're most vulnerable. And this was a parent who was it? It was someone with who'd had a career in the police force, and they're absolutely right. Child looks around, like picture an Xbox moment, sort of thing. The child's playing a game, they're cursing because the parent is not around to see. So also being mindful of what these vulnerable sets of users, children, the elderly, being mindful of how are they using these devices when you're not watching them. That's what I mean.
That's a great point, and I guess this applies almost equally to the elderly as well, right? So what you just shared applies to these two segments. What about businesses? What can businesses do in the current times for their cybersecurity posture? Like that's a very big question, but I just want to contextualize it from the point of like monitoring your own psychology, monitoring your own behaviors as you engage online.
I love that question. So another motivation of my work is that I don't just want to help large organizations who do have money and capabilities over things to sort of plan around the cybersecurity, but for small businesses as well. What they can do is several things. Firstly is understand that your cybersecurity is not a one-off fee and then it's fine. it's better to think of it like a little bit like car insurance. Every year, your car insurance is renewed. The insurance agency essentially wants to perform a risk assessment over you every year. That's what your premium is. So in this, the same thinking should apply to businesses. Even if it's just done once a year, review the cybersecurity. What are we doing with passwords? Do we have a password manager? Is the password manager that we're using, has it been in the news recently for any bad reasons? Are we using a VPN? Why should we use a VPN? Another thing as well as for small businesses is that cybersecurity, it can be intimidating because it's a different domain to their own. So that's absolutely understandable as well. So to small businesses, I would also say, if you're not sure, seek an expert advice. Much the same way that I have degrees in mathematics and psychology. I can't change a light bulb. If I were to change a light bulb, if I were to do electrical work, I might hurt myself. So I'm going to seek expert advice on that. So it's also being accepting that this risk is here to stay. It's perpetual, it's evolving. And if you're not sure, ask an expert. We here at the Security Research Institute, we've got resources, but we're just one organization. There are any number of resources online that you can go to. The E-Safety Commission, that's a really good one. The E-Safety Commission here in Australia also do a lot of, they're doing a lot for the psychology side of things. How do we protect the young and the elderly, as well as that? So that's what I would say to small businesses. And also don't let your users use simple passwords. And also don't let them recycle passwords because they'll do that.
Thank you. Have you, Oliver, studied somebody's response when this person is processing a cyber attack or a breach? Have you studied that end to end?
Yeah. So that was so I've done it in my simulation study that I mentioned in my PhD, but I've also done it during the 2018 paper. So when it was done end to end, and it really
interesting point. Now, I have dealt with a bunch of cyber attacks and cyber breaches in my career so far. So Can we walk through what happens and what is my psychological state at each point of time and how can I manage it? Because what I'm seeing is this is happening to many businesses globally. A lot of people are facing their first cyber attack. There's a set of responses which may be constructive or destructive, right? So maybe a dialogue between us when a cyber attack happens could be useful for our audience on how to process, the situation. Shall we do that?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so I wake up on, let's say, Thursday morning at 6:50 a.m. and I see a phishing email which tells me you have been found to not take care of your customer data. We have access to your system. We have extracted all this data. And if you do not pay us 0.2 Bitcoin in the next 72 hours, we will publish this online. What happens then? What is the psychological state?
The first thing that your brain is going to do is it's going to, and this is very inefficient, the word is down regulate, but it'll turn off the top part of your brain. So that's the cortex. That's that part there. And where all that energy goes is into a much deeper brain structure, and that's called the amygdala. So if that's your brain right there, so there's your frontal lobe. So it shuts down the part of your brain that's actually going to handle the problem. And the amygdala is right in the middle there. So it's around about here, just where the tip of my finger is. Your amygdala is what controls your threat response. So you might have heard of fight or flight. There's a third option, and that third option is much worse. That's called freeze. Now, if you've ever seen a David Attenborough documentary when a lion catches a gazelle or whatever lions eat, that the animal will sort of freeze up. The problem with that is that at the same time as that is happening, the problem's not being solved. B, you're in a state of effectively almost shock. So that's your first bodily response. Now, what you should probably do in that situation is get your body moving. You need to be able to that's one of the ways of getting your brain out of that sort of freeze state. What I would say to you to do then, the first thing that I would do is actually alert the police and the authorities. So here in Australia, at the moment, this is in a state of development where our response to cyber incidents is being developed by our government. But essentially, it depends on the organization you work for. If the organization is critical infrastructure, then the Australian Signals Directorate, I believe, can offer some assistance to that. But absent that option, what you then need to do is you need to start damage control. And that means telling all of your users, get on social media and explain social media, if you have access to their contact details, Don't send them an email, call them, because you've been hacked through an email. How do they know if that's...
So there may or may not be a policy on whether to contact the users or to inform the authorities, but let's assume there is a policy. Then your advice is start moving, execute on the policy for where the incident has happened, right? A breach has happened. Now, how long is this fight, flight, or freeze mode going to be?
To an extent that depends on the individual, and it depends a little bit on context. See, one of the reasons that I say get your body moving is because you can't fight that attack. You can't really flee that attack, but you can fool the body into offsetting some of that freeze response by getting up and moving around. Especially this is a visual thing as well. Look around the room, reorient yourself, leave the room, and be very aware of where you're projecting your gaze. It'll depower that amygdala response. Insofar as managing it, if the ransomware people really have you, and they really have you, then all you can do is alert your users and go into mitigation. So the stance that the government here has, and I don't disagree with it, but I think it's more complicated than one size fits all, is don't pay the ransomware. I agree with that, because you can pay the ransomware. That doesn't mean they're going to give you your files back. Like they might say, oh, that's great. We now want another 0.2 Bitcoin. You have no way of knowing. These are criminals. They're not really interested in being honest with you. I would say don't pay it is the most prudent way forward. However, for certain situations there are certain situations in which I think it does personally make sense to pay a ransomware, where, for example, if someone's life is at stake, that's a different calculus. But that should also be a decision that is involved. That's not an analyst level decision. That should be up to CEO. That should be everyone above as well. And then I suppose all you can do is after the fact is make peace with the tragedy that has happened and make sure it doesn't happen twice.
Oliver, you just took us down a path which is potentially the worst case scenario, right? You just took us down that path. What can we do to mitigate all of this all together? And I think I'm hinting at preparation. So if, let's say, we have spent a ton of time in your simulator or maybe preparing as a business, then what is the response going to be? Is it different? Is it similar? How's the response going to be from a psychology perspective? Let's say we spend some time preparing. Policies are in place. You have backups in place. You make sure you don't store customer data necessarily. If it is stored, it is encrypted. Now you have this email on a Thursday at 6 p.m.
Okay, well then the bodily response is going to be a lot different. So say you've got your backups. The first thing that I would do, your amygdala response might not be that bad. It might not put you fully into, actually, no, what's going to happen is it's going to be less likely to make you freeze, and it's going to put you more in a fight sort of position. And fight doesn't mean any sort of kinetic thing. What it actually means is you're solving the problem. You are fighting to find a solution. So I suppose your response isn't going to be so disempowered if you're in that position, and if you're ransomware, then that is the ideal position to be in, where you've got the backups, the data is encrypted, so even though they've got it, they can't really use it. What I would do in that situation is do not reply to them at all. Go through and perform a background check, like check everything, and then recheck it, and then reset everyone's passwords, and then recheck it again. In that instance there, I would be looking to try and work out where, if anywhere in the organization, that vulnerability came from. Did a user use their work email to sign up to a site that was a bit suspect? It doesn't even have to be that, actually. Run everyone's email through haveibeenpwned.com. Things get out. That's why they call it a leak. It wasn't supposed to happen. So in that situation there, I would go through, check, reset all the passwords, lock the doors to the castle, and then you can reopen for business only after you are sure everything is now fine. And I think as well, if you're a business in that position, accept the fact that it's something that you want to do well, not quick. Well, you want to do it quickly and you want to do it well, and that's not usually cheap.
What you're saying is preparation equals empowerment, and that's a very powerful statement here.
Absolutely, it is.
Very nice. Thanks for sharing that. Now, Oliver, there are a few things more that I'd like to ask you. This was an interesting exercise. I think it leads up nicely to the next question that I have as well. Do you foresee a time when, let's say, there needs to be a cybersecurity manifesto. The best practices that come out from your work in psychology at the intersection with cybersecurity, you already are suggesting some changes that we can make to software design, some best practices that we can follow to make sure our brain responds in a good way. And we spend so much time online that, these things can have health, physical effects on us as well. Like how pilots have, they study human factors and limitations, and there is a whole set of course that is required for pilots to go through. Do you think developers or software professionals need to go through a similar course, best practices for cybersecurity? And equally, do you think there should be a manifesto, like how there is for Agile Manifesto, where you start, having Agile rituals to develop software in a way that is more optimized and efficient?
I think that's a very needed. I think the society today needs that. It just simply does, and that manifesto should also be something which it should be industry specific as well. So, for example, the cyber vulnerabilities in healthcare do not look at all the same as they do in telecommunications. So, it should be industry specific. And as far as a manifesto goes, actually not just industry specific, but user specific. If I, as a parent, want to make sure that my son is 6, so he doesn't go online all that much, but the way that I would want to parent, I suppose, a 10-year-old who has an Xbox Live account, plays Roblox, I don't know what other games kids play, it's going to be very different to a 17-year-old who's got a million different chat message accounts and things of that nature. So it should be user specific. It should be organization specific. And I think as well for this, moving forward, it should possibly look something like an accreditation system. So the software engineer can be security accredited. Now, what would motivate that from a business perspective is if I'm a person who's hiring a team of software engineers, for example, and I've got 100 people who've been lined up who've applied for my position. Well, then I don't have 100. I don't have time to go through 100. So what I'm going to do is when I'm at the stage where people have given me their resumes, I'm going to get rid of anyone who isn't cybersecurity certified. You don't have to be expert in it, but you can't be ignorant of it. And I think by having it as an accreditation process, that could be done nationally or internationally, but having that accreditation process as well means that whatever body accredits that can continuously improve those goalposts. As new cyber threats come out, they can change what it means to be cyber certified. Electricians in Australia have to go through much the same thing. When electrical standards are changed, well, all the electricians have to do some professional development to update their skill sets. And I think that's entirely necessary as well. Like, for example, parents. My parents, when I was a 13-year-old, 15-year-old, there was no TikTok. I was a math nerd. I didn't chat online to most people. I just played video games and Halo. Like, it's not the same today. So having this as a continuously developing position, teachers also, I think, have a very good could play a very powerful role in that manifesto idea of yours as well. But certainly it's necessary, and I do hope for a time that we get there.
Okay, then let me just dig a little bit deeper into that. What are the kind of people that should have a say in developing this cybersecurity manifesto?
That's a great question. I think academic institutions. I think because, and it's not deferring to the academic for the complex answer to a complex question, but academic institutions are a good example of organization that is at risk. So both in terms of the number of people on staff. You also have people on staff who fit those different user categories perfectly. You've got good users, not the bad users. You've got good users, but you've got also users who are maybe not as technologically literate. So, for example, students in engineering are going to be much more technologically literate than students who study fine arts, and that's fine. But it means that if we as an organization can work out, okay, how do we communicate this to people? I think that's how we communicate it internally within a university setting. That can apply quite well into the real world, but also the users have to come back and explain stuff to us as well. So when, for example, a standard is published, we also have to perform post hoc analysis. has that standard measurably decreased the number of incidences that have happened out in the wild? So it also shouldn't be seen as a one-time thing. It should be done, like I said earlier, for the organizations, yearly updates, possibly sooner as well. Like, for example, the time difference between ChatGPT 3.5 and 4 was a matter of months. If that's a decent analogy for how quickly technology can evolve, then maybe it's a case that we don't just do it once a year, we do it continuously. So, for example, if a researcher discovers, or actually anyone, if anyone discovers a new vulnerability, say in, I don't know, a Microsoft product, well, you should be able to, like a bug bounty, submit it to the accrediting organization, and there should then be some sort of mechanism that looks at that vulnerability and says, oh no, look at how many other people need to be told about this. It's an alert system. And it's an alert, but you want the alert system to be efficient. You're listening to the users as well as looking at results of that manifesto.
Thanks, Oliver. That's a very tough question. I'm so happy you gave a good crack at it, right? So really appreciate your time on this. That manifesto, which you mentioned, that needs to be continuously updated because threats are evolving very fast as well, right? And threats are evolving because technology is evolving very fast, not just ChatGPT, but other kinds of technologies as well, right? This leads me to the next question quite nicely that I had in mind to ask you. What do you see as the biggest risks and opportunities for businesses in the years to come?
The biggest risk, I think, for businesses is the unknown unknown. You can't afford to be a business that fixes the cybersecurity problem once and then it's fine. We've paid for the antivirus. It doesn't work that way anymore. Or at the very least, if it ever becomes like that, then it'll be in a society much, much, much more advanced than what we're at now. You have to make peace with the fact that just like your car insurance, you have to do a rolling risk assessment. That's the first thing. So the risk is that you're not treating it as a changing risk. That's number one. And number two as well, I would say that the biggest risk is a lot of your information is out there. If it's on social media, if the answers to your security questions can be found by open source intelligence, then it is not secure. It's cataclysmic what can happen. One of the examples I use is suppose that you have two characters. Character A is a bank manager and character B is a carpenter who employs a handful of other carpenters. Now, let's assume that both of their passwords are stolen by an attacker. Well, this person, it's still bad, but maybe a small number of people are going to be affected. A lot of people are affected by the bank manager's password being leaked. So you also have to understand then that part of the risk is that it's not just about the individual. It's not about the individual person or the individual organization because everything is linked. If your password to your organization system is the same password that you use on your banking app, what do you think is going to happen if the password credentials for one are stolen? They're going to go for the other one as well. Distributed attacks, that's another risk. So minimizing exposure, your attackable surface, as it were. That's definitely what I would say.
What I feel you're advocating is becoming more sensitive to the cyber threat, right? And leading us down a path where we're almost becoming secretive because, don't put out information out there. Don't be here on social media so much, or don't put out so much of your private information on social media. So, the two words that come to mind here would be sensitive towards being secretive, right? And therefore, like a whole class of technologies start to come to mind, which is all your privacy preserving technologies, right? You could have pseudonyms that you could be playing with, or you could have, that's what I feel is going to become a big thing as we go forward, just based on your description of the problem. Am I right?
You are. I suppose what I would add to that, though, is that, and this, I suppose, answers the second part of your question, the opportunities. The opportunity is if you haven't been attacked yet, there's an opportunity to move now. So, and I love the password one because passwords, I can't remember who referred to it in this way, but they referred to it as the cockroaches of the internet because the human brain doesn't do random very well unless it's very sick. But a random password is the best password. Use a password manager. You have to accept the human limitation and work with it. That's sort of like what I mentioned earlier is like assume out of the set of your users what happens in a breach. Well, if you've got a password manager, one click reset, done. That's the opportunity is that move now is what I would say.
And what if you have already been hacked? What is the opportunity there? I'm just pushing our thinking.
Yeah. No, I like it. The opportunity that, look, if you have already been hacked, you must alert your users as quickly as is humanly possible, mitigate the attack, minimize the damage. But then once the dust has settled and you're organizationally in a better place after that attack, I would say be very public about it, because we're also at a, like, for example, in Australia, we've had a few very high profile cyber attacks come our way recently. You may have heard about Optus and Medicare, and I believe Latitude was another one. Now, the dust has yet to really settle on attacks of that magnitude. But the utility in those companies, one of the utilities of those companies being very public about it, and actually, like for example, Optus lost, I think, 30% of its customer base. It's massive. But what that does for society at large is it provides us with cautionary tales, warnings. Look at what happens. And it's absolutely terrible. But the silver lining is that if you're a company that has been hacked, after the damage is settled, tell others about it. Because it might be the case that you own a business and it gets attacked, and 3 months down the track, you've put it back together again. You might be out at a conference. You might be able to tell others who might otherwise not care about cyber. What do you mean? We've got Norton antivirus. Isn't that enough? Like, no. It's not. Because also that's something called episodic memory. When you can hear it from an individual who's experienced it, it changes how well people hear the message. Very different to a public ad campaign. Make sure your password's safe. Use a password manager versus a friend, a colleague even. Hey, this happened to me. Make sure it doesn't happen to you. It's a different impact.
That's how humans survive, right? Yuval Noah Harari in the book Sapiens. We survive because we can tell stories. And we survive better than other species because we can write about these stories, and this can be passed from one generation to another. Cyber threat was not a threat a couple of generations ago. It's becoming a threat now. In some instances, it is deadly. In most instances, you tend to feel like, hey, you know what? My data is online, but that's okay. I'm alive. I'm okay. That's not an issue. So I think as a society, we're grappling with this. Because at Cyber we talk to businesses globally. We see businesses take cyber risk very seriously, where the regulatory environment is very strong. So if, let's say, there are laws, there are penalties around these things tend to happen mostly in developed markets, regulated segments of developing markets. That's when businesses take cyber risk quite seriously. But in other areas, there are a lot of there's this mindset that, hey, it's data. We are humans. As humans, we're okay. Our data is at risk. So what? Right? So I think what you just mentioned will create this cascading set of activities where, as stories get told, more and more of these stories get told, the tolerance against cyber risk will become, people want to treat cyber risk much more seriously than before, because things that can be done with your data may at first seem like it may seem harmless, but actually they can be very harmful, right? If you are sharing your dog's name on Instagram, for example, that is what could lead to a compromise of your banking information and your money, right? People are not forming that connection yet. So I love what you just said, which is talk more, essentially, tell the story.
Absolutely, like, because that's it's spreading the warning through culture. And it's interesting that, like, to the user, I think that you're describing there, the user that perhaps is a bit more either dismissive or resistant to cybersecurity changes. Yes, you are still alive, and that's fantastic. But what does it mean now if you go to a bank to get a home loan out and your credit score, you don't have a credit score anymore? You don't have, the bank will look at you and say, well, you've taken out a loan of $200,000 3 years ago. We thought you were paying it. What's this about? Like, you understand the point. So it's like, yes, you're still alive, but I mean, you can be alive and bad things can still happen to you. And that's how trauma works, is something terrible that you survive, but trauma isn't something you just walk away from. You have to, it's a long path out of it. So I absolutely love your podcast for this reason. It spreads these stories, it builds this awareness, and we can have these conversations that we're starting to have, and especially having them on a global scale as well. I mean, we're countries apart, but that's fantastic, because cyber is also a global problem. So we need global solutions to it, and that means global conversations.
Thank you so much, Oliver. This has been a fascinating discussion, and thank you so much for your time. Is there any final words that you'd like to have for our audience on the topic of cyber, topic of psychology, the intersection?
I suppose what I would like to leave your audience with as well, just regarding that manifesto idea. And I think that if I might add a note from psychology is that there's a few different ways to motivate and change behavior: positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and punishment. So leading through mandate. Now that makes sense to an extent, but also trying to think positive. How can we positively encourage behavior change? That's another way as well. So there's gummy bears in the Security Operations Center. That's one method. But another method might be, if you're an organization, rewarding people who click alert junk email. It's not just junk. There's important information in there about who might be trying to attack you. So I think it's important not to, a healthy amount of catastrophization and realizing that there is danger out there. That's absolutely important. But there's also hope for this change, hope that we can adapt and overcome. But I must say then, thank you so much for having me on your podcast. It's been an absolute honor. I'm really looking forward to watching it.
Thank you so much, Oliver. That was fantastic. And we will be in touch again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.